Dr. Naomi Carter was not the kind of person who followed the crowd. A highly skilled doctor with a warm smile and a sharp mind, Naomi had earned a reputation for being a top specialist at the local hospital. Her dedication to her patients was well known, and she had a knack for making people feel comfortable, no matter their background or concerns. But there was one thing about Naomi that often got her attention, both good and bad: her face tattoos. Naomi had always loved body art. She saw tattoos as a way to express herself, to tell stories that words couldn't capture. The tattoos on her face were particularly meaningful to her. They were symbols of her African heritage, her strength, and the journey she'd taken to become the person she was today. Some tattoos were delicate designs, while others were bold, making a statement. They were not just for decoration, but were a part of her identity, a visual representation of everything she stood for. Yet, not everyone understood Naomi's tattoos. Many people, especially those in her professional world, couldn't see beyond the ink on her face. Naomi had heard whispers, seen raised eyebrows, and even been told by some patients that she didn't look doctor-like. Some people assumed that tattoos made her less professional, less capable. They judged her based on her appearance instead of her expertise and kindness. But Naomi didn't mind. She had worked hard to become the doctor she was, and her tattoos were just a small part of who she was. She was confident in her abilities and proud of her heritage. However, not everyone shared her outlook. One evening, after finishing a long shift at the hospital, Naomi was walking to her car in the parking lot. The sun was setting, casting a soft orange glow over the area. As she made her way to the car, a police officer approached her. Naomi had never seen him before, but she didn't think much of it. Officers often patrolled the parking lot, especially at night. "Excuse me, ma'am," the officer said, his voice stern. Naomi stopped in her tracks, wondering what he wanted. The officer, who was in his 40s, looked her over with a disapproving gaze. "Can you tell me why you think it's okay to walk around with tattoos on your face?" he asked, his tone judgmental. Naomi raised an eyebrow, a little taken aback. "Excuse me," she replied, trying to keep her voice calm. She was used to being judged for her tattoos, but this was different. The officer was questioning her like she had done something wrong. "You don't think this looks unprofessional?" the officer continued, gesturing toward her face. Naomi took a deep breath, staying calm. "These tattoos are part of who I am. They don't make me any less professional. I'm a doctor, and I'm proud of my work and my appearance." Her voice was steady, but she could feel her heart beating faster, the tension rising. But the officer wasn't backing down. He took another step toward her, his face hardening. Naomi could tell he wasn't going to let this go, and she wasn't sure where this confrontation was going to lead. The situation quickly started to feel more uncomfortable. Naomi could sense that the officer wasn't just concerned about her tattoos. There was something else in his attitude that made her uneasy. She had dealt with people who didn't understand her tattoos before, but never with someone who seemed so upset by them. It wasn't just curiosity. It felt like judgment. The officer, whose name she had learned was Officer David Carter, took another step closer, his eyes narrowing as he continued to eye her tattoos. Naomi stood still, trying to remain calm. She had dealt with many stressful situations at the hospital, but this felt different. She was used to the operating room, not a confrontation in a parking lot with a police officer. "You think people will respect you like this?" Officer Carter asked, his voice still stern. "You're walking around looking like this." He waved his hand towards her tattoos, his eyes not meeting hers. Naomi took a deep breath, holding back her frustration. "I've worked hard for everything I have, including my tattoos," she said firmly. "These tattoos are part of who I am, just like my education, my career, and my dedication to helping people." Officer Carter scoffed, clearly not understanding. He seemed to dismiss her words as if they didn't matter. "I don't know if anyone will take you seriously like this," he muttered. He clearly didn't see her as someone who could be a doctor, just because of the tattoos on her face. Naomi felt the situation growing tense. She knew she had to handle it carefully. She didn't want the officer to think she was being disrespectful, but at the same time, she wasn't about to back down from her identity. I am a doctor. I save lives. That's what matters, not how I look, Naomi said, her voice calm but confident. She had dealt with people's ignorance before, but she wasn't used to someone in authority treating her this way. Officer Carter didn't seem to hear her. Instead, he stepped forward, his expression turning more serious. You shouldn't be walking around like this, he said again, as if his opinion could change her. Naomi could feel her patience wearing thin. Look, I understand that you may not agree with my appearance, but I'm not breaking any laws, Naomi said, her voice growing firmer. I'm just trying to get to my car. But the officer wasn't listening. He raised his hand as if signaling for her to stay still, and Naomi felt a chill run down her spine. There was something in his eyes now, something that made her uneasy. It wasn't just about the tattoos anymore. She could feel the situation escalating, and she wasn't sure what would happen next. Maybe you need a lesson in how to act in public, Officer Carter said, his voice more forceful now. Naomi's heart began to race. She had always been a calm and composed person, especially in stressful situations. But now, standing in this parking lot with a police officer who seemed more interested in controlling her than understanding her, she felt a growing sense of fear. She didn't know if she should back away, speak up more, or even try to diffuse the tension. But as the officer stepped closer, Naomi began to feel the weight of the situation. What had started as an uncomfortable conversation was beginning to feel dangerous. Naomi could feel her pulse quickening as Officer Carter stepped even closer. Her mind raced, but she kept herself steady. She had been in tense situations before at the hospital, but this was different. She could feel the officer's anger in the air, thick and uncomfortable. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me, Officer Carter said sharply. His voice wasn't asking anymore. It was demanding. Naomi's instinct told her something was wrong. She was not about to let this man intimidate her, especially when she had done nothing wrong. I haven't done anything wrong, Naomi replied, trying to stay calm. I'm just going to my car. But Officer Carter didn't seem to hear her. His expression turned harder, and before Naomi could react, he grabbed her arm. The sudden force of his grip made Naomi flinch. She hadn't expected this, and it caught her off guard. Hey, let go of me, Naomi exclaimed, pulling her arm away. She was taken aback, unsure of what was happening. The officer's eyes were cold now, and his body language made it clear that he wasn't willing to listen to her. Instead of letting go, Officer Carter tightened his grip, and Naomi stumbled slightly as he dragged her a step back. She could feel panic rising in her chest. What was happening? Why was he treating her like this? All she wanted was to get to her car, not to be dragged into some unnecessary conflict. Stop it. You're hurting me, Naomi shouted, trying to break free, but the officer didn't seem to care. His grip on her arm grew stronger, and in that moment, Naomi felt completely powerless. Her heart pounded in her chest as Officer Carter pulled her closer, trying to force her to the ground. The scene felt surreal, like something out of a nightmare. Naomi wasn't used to being the one on the receiving end of such force, especially when she had done nothing wrong. Tears began to well up in her eyes, not from pain, but from the shock of it all. How had it come to this? Why was this officer treating her like a criminal when she was just a doctor trying to get home? In a desperate attempt to free herself, Naomi pushed against Officer Carter, her mind racing for a way out of this situation. She was frightened, but knew she had to stay calm. She couldn't let herself get overwhelmed. Just as things were escalating further, Naomi heard a familiar voice in the distance. Stop. Let go of her. It was a voice she knew well. Her husband, Marcus Carter, had arrived. Naomi's breath caught in her throat, and a sense of relief washed over her. Marcus, who owned the police force, was the one person who could end this situation. He had the power to stop this madness and make things right. She looked up to see him striding toward her, his face set in determination. "David, let go of her," Marcus shouted, his voice filled with authority. Officer Carter paused, his grip loosening slightly as he looked over his shoulder. The sight of Marcus caused a shift in the officer's behavior. The anger that had once been so clear on his face now seemed replaced with hesitation. Naomi's heart still raced, but a small sense of hope flickered within her. Her husband was here now, and she knew that things would soon change. The confusion, the fear, and the frustration of the moment were starting to fade, replaced by the realization that the person who could end this injustice was right in front of her. Naomi's heart raced as she saw Marcus approaching. In a moment of pure relief, she realized that this nightmare might finally be over. She had always known that Marcus, with his calm demeanor and his position in the community, was someone people listened to. But this was different. This was the man she loved, and he was about to face down the officer who had treated her so unfairly. "David," I said, "let go of her." Marcus's voice rang out, calm but filled with authority. Naomi could see that the officer, David Carter, seemed to hesitate for a brief moment, almost as if he wasn't sure what to do. Naomi's arm, still gripped tightly by the officer, began to feel the tension start to loosen. Officer Carter glanced nervously over his shoulder, his eyes wide with surprise. Naomi could see him trying to process what was happening. He hadn't expected Marcus to show up, and certainly not with such confidence. There was a brief silence, as if the officer was weighing his options. "Marcus, Officer Carter began, but Marcus interrupted him, his voice firm and unyielding. "Let go of my wife, David." "Now," Marcus said, taking a step closer. His presence was strong, calm, and commanding. Naomi could feel her body start to relax as she heard Marcus's steady voice. David Carter, still holding onto Naomi's arm, was clearly shaken. The realization hit him hard. This wasn't just a random confrontation with a woman on the street. Naomi's husband wasn't just any man. Marcus was a well-known and influential figure in the city. In fact, Marcus owned the police force, a fact most people didn't realize because of his quiet, business-focused nature. But now, facing him directly, Officer Carter understood the power dynamics at play. Naomi could see the officer's face turning pale. He knew now that what had started as a small disagreement was turning into something much larger. His hand, which had gripped Naomi's arm so tightly just moments ago, was beginning to loosen. Slowly, he let go, stepping back with a look of fear and uncertainty. Naomi rubbed her sore wrist, feeling a mixture of relief and disbelief. "Thank you," Naomi whispered to Marcus, her voice shaky but full of gratitude. Marcus didn't take his eyes off Officer Carter, but he gave Naomi a soft, reassuring smile. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle now that the tension was starting to lift. Naomi nodded, though her heart was still pounding in her chest. "I am now," she said, her voice still a little shaky. Marcus turned to Officer Carter. His expression was calm, but his words were pointed. "What do you think you're doing, David?" "You know better than this," Marcus said, his voice carrying a weight that left no room for argument. "This is not how we treat people, especially not in this city." David Carter didn't respond at first. He stood there, looking guilty and uncertain. Naomi could tell that he was realizing how wrong he had been, but she wasn't sure if it was regret or fear of Marcus that was making him hesitate. Marcus didn't wait for an apology or an excuse. "I'll handle this," he said, his voice steady and clear. "You need to go back to your patrol. We'll talk about this later." David nodded silently, his face flushed with embarrassment. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Naomi and Marcus standing in the parking lot. Naomi's emotions were still all over the place. She was shaken by what had just happened, but she was also grateful that Marcus had been there to stop it. As Marcus reached out to gently touch her arm, Naomi felt a rush of relief. The worst was over, but this incident was far from being forgotten. There was much more to come, both for Naomi and for the officer who had crossed a line. As Officer Carter walked away, his back stiff and his steps heavy, Naomi felt a strange mix of emotions. She was shaken by what had just happened, but seeing Marcus take control of the situation brought her a sense of comfort. Still, the memory of how the officer had treated her lingered in her mind, and it made her feel uneasy. "Are you sure you're okay?" Marcus asked, his voice gentle, but there was a hint of concern in his eyes. He reached out, brushing his fingers against her arm in a reassuring gesture. Naomi nodded, trying to shake off the lingering fear. "I'm okay now. You were right there, and I'm so glad you came when you did." Marcus looked at her with a small smile, though his eyes still held a trace of seriousness. "I'll always be here for you," he said softly, but then his face hardened, and he looked toward the direction where Officer Carter had gone. "That man shouldn't have treated you like that. He went too far." Naomi agreed, but she knew this was just the beginning. The situation had escalated quickly, and she wasn't sure what would come of it. She knew one thing for certain. Officer Carter's actions wouldn't go unnoticed, especially now that Marcus was involved. "Let's get in the car. We'll talk about this later," Marcus suggested, his voice calm but firm. Naomi agreed, and the two of them made their way to the car. She felt a sense of relief just being next to Marcus. He had always been a calm, steady presence in her life, and right now, she needed that more than ever. As they drove away from the parking lot, the silence between them was heavy. Naomi glanced at Marcus, wondering what he was thinking. He had always been the quiet one, the strong, silent type. She could tell that he was deep in thought, and she could sense that he was working through the next steps in his mind. Finally, after a few minutes of silence, Marcus spoke. "Naomi, I need to tell you something," he said, his tone serious. Naomi looked over at him, curious. "What is it?" she asked, her heart suddenly racing again. She could tell that whatever he was about to say was important. Marcus took a deep breath. "David Carter, he's not just any officer. He works for me," he said slowly, watching her reaction closely. Naomi blinked, trying to process what he had just said. "What do you mean he works for you?" she asked, feeling confused. Marcus nodded, his gaze focused on the road ahead. "I own the police force. I've been involved with it for years now. I don't talk about it much because I don't want anyone to think I'm using my influence for personal gain. But David works for me. He's under my leadership." Naomi's mind was racing. She had always known Marcus was successful, but this was a level of power and influence she hadn't fully understood. "So, you're saying that officer, the one who treated me so badly, works for you?" Marcus nodded again. "Yes, and that's why I had to step in. What he did was completely unacceptable, and it's not something I can let slide." His voice was filled with determination now. Naomi sat back in her seat, trying to absorb everything Marcus had just revealed. The man who had hurt her was connected to her husband's empire in a way she hadn't expected. It was a shock, but she knew Marcus wasn't someone who would let this slide. He was going to make sure this situation was handled, no matter what. As they drove in silence, Naomi couldn't help but feel a sense of disbelief. What had started as a simple walk to her car had turned into something far more complicated. But one thing was clear: Marcus wasn't going to let anyone, no matter their position, get away with treating her like that. As the car hummed along the quiet streets, Naomi couldn't shake the weight of Marcus's revelation. She had known her husband was a successful businessman, but she never imagined that his influence extended into something as powerful as owning the police force. Her mind spun as she processed everything that had just happened: the officer's attack on her, Marcus's unexpected intervention, and now the unsettling fact that the officer worked for Marcus. It all felt like a twist of fate, something she never could have expected. When they finally pulled into their driveway, Naomi remained silent, lost in thought. Marcus parked the car and turned off the engine. He glanced over at her, his expression serious but not unkind. "We need to talk," he said quietly. Naomi nodded, feeling her heart thud in her chest. She knew that this conversation was going to be important. The officer's actions were not something they could simply forget, especially now that Marcus had made it clear that he had the power to do something about it. But Naomi wasn't sure what that something was, and she was about to find out. They stepped out of the car and made their way inside the house. Naomi walked slowly, her mind still processing everything that had happened. As they entered the living room, Marcus motioned for her to sit down, and he took a seat across from her. "Naomi, I want you to understand something," Marcus began, his voice calm but filled with determination. "David's actions today were completely wrong, and I won't let them slide. But I also need you to understand that this situation is complicated." Naomi looked at him, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean by complicated?" Marcus took a deep breath. "David Carter is a good officer. He's made mistakes in the past, but he's generally been reliable. He's never crossed a line like this before. But this, what he did to you, was beyond unacceptable. It's going to be handled, Naomi. I promise you that." Naomi listened carefully, her emotions still running high. She appreciated Marcus's calmness, but she also couldn't ignore the feeling that this situation had the potential to cause major problems. It wasn't just about the officer's behavior. It was about the system and the power that Marcus held. It was about how far things could go if this wasn't dealt with correctly. "I don't want this to turn into something bigger than it needs to be," Naomi said, her voice steady but filled with concern. "I just want justice. I don't want this to be about your position or the power you have. I want it to be about what's right." Marcus's eyes softened as he looked at her. "I understand. And that's exactly why I'm going to take care of it. I don't want you to feel like this is something you have to fight alone. We'll make sure this never happens again." Naomi nodded, feeling a small sense of relief. She trusted Marcus, and she knew that he wouldn't let the officer's actions go unchecked. But she also knew that this was going to be a challenging road. The truth was, power and influence often made things more complicated than they seemed on the surface. "We'll handle this the right way," Marcus continued. "But I also need you to know that there will be people who won't like what happens next. People who think that because I own the police force, I'm doing this for personal reasons. But I want you to know, Naomi, I'm doing this for you. And for anyone who's ever been treated unfairly because of their appearance or who they are." Naomi looked at Marcus, her heart full of gratitude. She had always known he was a man of integrity, but hearing him speak like this gave her a new sense of hope. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that together, they could face whatever came next. With a deep breath, she smiled at him. "Thank you, Marcus. I know you'll do the right thing." Marcus returned her smile, his eyes full of conviction. "We're in this together, Naomi. Always." The days that followed the incident were filled with tension and uncertainty. Naomi found herself replaying the confrontation in her mind over and over again. It wasn't just about what had happened to her, but the deeper questions it raised about power, privilege, and the way people were treated because of how they looked. The whole situation had shaken her, and she couldn't help but wonder how far-reaching the consequences of that one moment might be. Marcus, too, was feeling the weight of what had happened. Though he had promised Naomi he would handle everything, he knew that this incident was about to spark a lot more attention than they had anticipated. Naomi was no longer just a respected doctor with face tattoos. She was a symbol. A symbol of the challenges faced by many people who were judged for how they looked, and she was about to be thrust into the spotlight. The media caught wind of the story within hours. The headlines were filled with outrage about the violent treatment Naomi had endured. Social media exploded with comments, many people expressing their support for Naomi, while others questioned why the officer had been allowed to treat her that way. The story became a hot topic across the city, and soon the public was divided. In the days that followed, Naomi found herself at the center of it all. She was interviewed by local news outlets, and her story spread quickly across the country. Naomi's phone rang constantly, with reporters, advocates, and even strangers reaching out to offer their support. Many praised her for speaking out, for standing up against the injustice she had faced, and for using her voice to bring attention to issues that often went ignored. But there were also those who criticized her. Some said she was making a bigger deal out of the situation than it was, and others questioned her decision to pursue legal action. Naomi knew that the situation wasn't simple, and she was well aware of the people who would try to twist it for their own agendas. But she also knew that she couldn't ignore what had happened. She couldn't let her story fade into the background. She had to do something, not just for herself, but for all the people who had been treated unfairly because of their appearance or background. Meanwhile, Marcus was feeling the pressure from his position. As the owner of the police force, he had always been careful to keep a low profile, never wanting his influence to overshadow the work of the officers. But now he couldn't hide. The backlash was coming from all sides, and people were questioning whether his power was the reason why the officer had been allowed to act with impunity. Some even accused Marcus of protecting his own, given the deep connection between his business and the police department. He understood the public's frustration. What had happened to Naomi was wrong, and people wanted answers. They wanted justice, but Marcus was determined to make things right. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to face whatever challenges lay ahead. He wasn't going to let anyone's prejudice or ignorance go unchallenged, not when it came to his wife, and not when it came to doing what was right. As the days passed, Naomi felt both the weight and the power of the public attention. She wasn't sure where the legal battle would take her, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going to back down. This wasn't just about her face tattoos anymore. It was about standing up for fairness, for respect, and for the belief that no one should be judged by how they look. For the first time, Naomi felt the power of her voice. She knew she had a chance to make a difference, and she wasn't about to let it slip away. The days that followed Naomi's decision to pursue legal action were filled with a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and planning. She knew that this would be a long and difficult road, but she also knew it was the right thing to do. With Marcus's support, she felt more determined than ever to stand up for what was right. Meanwhile, the public backlash against Officer David Carter was growing. People were outraged by the way he had treated Naomi. Social media flooded with comments, some in support of Naomi, others condemning Officer Carter's actions. News outlets ran stories about the incident, with many questioning the power dynamics at play. People were beginning to ask whether it was time for a larger conversation about how law enforcement treated civilians, especially those who didn't fit into the usual norms of society. Naomi's story began to spark a wider movement. Activists, community leaders, and everyday people who had been unfairly treated by authority figures rallied behind her. They shared their own stories of discrimination, making it clear that Naomi's experience was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of something much bigger, an issue that had been ignored for too long. Naomi became a voice for those who had long been silenced, and she was determined to keep speaking out, no matter the cost. For Marcus, things were not as simple. As the owner of the police force, he felt the weight of the responsibility even more heavily now. He knew that he had to act quickly and decisively, but he also knew that his actions would be under intense scrutiny. Everyone was watching, hoping he would do the right thing, but also questioning whether he could remain unbiased when his own business was involved. Marcus immediately launched an internal investigation into Officer Carter's behavior. The process was thorough, and the findings were clear. Officer Carter had not only used excessive force, but he had also violated the department's policies regarding professional conduct. There was no longer any doubt that what he had done was wrong. The days following Officer Carter's dismissal were a mix of relief and reflection for Naomi. While the legal battle and the media attention were starting to settle down, she couldn't forget what had happened. The incident had changed her, just as it had changed her relationship with Marcus. They had both been through something difficult, and the road to healing was just beginning. As Naomi stood in front of her mirror one evening, she studied her face. The tattoos she had always worn